You can watch a live stream of the show on Facebook or YouTube at Stacy on the Right. Now, back to the show on American Family Radio and Urban Family Talk.
Welcome back to the program. It is a pleasure to be with you. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Stacy on the Right. You can also find out more about what we do at urbanfamilytalk.com, including the Marriage and Family Conference, which is coming up in June. You can also find out everything you want to know. See the blog called The Stand and so much more over at afr.net. Right now, it's my pleasure to welcome John Malcolm. He's the Vice President for the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. John, thank you for coming on today.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so you have a ton of things to explain to us, me included, and the listeners, you do. I read your blurb, and I was so glad that Devin was able to get you on today, because you're just like, you're sliding in at the perfect moment. And I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. I never pretend. So I need you to help me get what's going on here. I see people on the right freaking out, John, because they're like, next, it's going to be gun control. You know, they're going to make all the kids go to indoctrination camps. They'll be able to use the emergency order. And I don't necessarily see it that way, because I know this isn't the first emergency order that's ever been issued. We do have a changing political landscape. Tell us what we need to know about this this new thing. We live in a new era now. President Trump has declared a national emergency.
Sure. So let's figure out exactly what the president has done today. So Congress gave him $1.375 billion to build a barrier or part of a barrier along the southern border, and he has said that he thinks that this is insufficient. And so he has now invoked the National Emergencies Act to get another, roughly little over $7 billion for this purpose. The National Emergencies Act is a post-Watergate piece of legislation, and all it does is it sets up a procedure for the president once he declares a national emergency. What a president has to do once he declares a national emergency is to notify Congress what that emergency is, what it is he proposes to do, and what other statutes are out there that allow him to do what it is that he wants to do, right? Now, so the president has laid out his case as to why this is a national emergency. He's talked about, 73% increase in fentanyl coming through the border in the last year, 38% increase in heroin and methamphetamine. He's talked about, a dramatic increase in asylum claims, gang members and suspected terrorists, and people with criminal records being apprehended at the border by ICE agents and Customs and Border Patrol agents. He's talked about the plight of people who are carried across the border, a third of women being sexually assaulted, et cetera, $2.5 billion being made by these coyote human smuggler organizations every year. And he's also talked about the harm that is caused in terms of all the crime that is committed by people who are successful in getting into our country illegally. He referred to this as a sort of invasion today. So that is his case, factual case for making an emergency. And now the other statutes that he is relying upon is he's looking to get $600 million from the Treasury Department's Drug Forfeiture Fund. That's a statute that allows the Secretary of the Treasury to take money that's in this fund to be used for legitimate law enforcement purposes, and certainly stopping human smuggling and drugs at the border is a legitimate law enforcement function. And then he's looked at two other statutes that are about the Department of Defense. One of them is he's looking for the Pentagon has its own drug interdiction program, and he says he's going to take $2.5 billion from that. That's Title 10, Section 284 of the United States Code, and that provision clearly says that you can use those funds in order to build fences, install lighting, et cetera, to block drug smuggling operations. And then the other section where he's going to get the last $3.6 billion says that when the president declares a national emergency, and it's going to involve the use of the armed forces, that you can engage in military construction projects in order to support the armed forces. Now, the reason why I say all of that is this. There is no question that presidents have broad authority under the National Emergencies Act, but it is not limitless. The president cannot just say, I want to stop global warming, or I want to stop whatever, fill in the blank crisis, and therefore I'm going to declare a national emergency. If you do that, you have to then rely on these other statutes that say what you can do under what circumstances. So far as I know, there is no other federal statute that says the president can take money that's otherwise been appropriated and divert it in order to combat global warming, or he can take whatever money he's going to use to stop the importation of any guns, lawful and unlawful. I mean, importing guns illegally is already a crime. There's already a lot of money spent on that, and in fact, if anything, this barrier will probably help enhance that effort. So I understand people's concerns about what kind of a precedent this sets. But as you have correctly said, presidents have declared national emergencies for a whole host of reasons ever since the act was promulgated, and it's not a limitless authority.
Okay. What an amazing breakdown. If we only had a 5-minute interview, you would have covered basically all the questions I had. Now, because you covered all those and you did a great job, you know what happens when you do well. You have to do more. So let's keep going, John. Sure. You mentioned gun confiscation. So what I've seen is people have already been tweeting me because I'm a Second Amendment proponent and member of the NRA. And they're like, yeah, and when it's President Kamala Harris, we're going to come for your guns. And I was like, well, you better bring guns and tanks because you're not getting anything from over here. But that doesn't fall into a national emergency. If there's like a spate or rash of school shootings and a bunch of people are killed or whatever the case might be, we already have laws that cover that. A national emergency has to be something that isn't covered. Is that what's, I mean, because I just want to be clear, people are afraid of this. People on the right are actually on message boards arguing with each other on just who's going to make who do what. We're going to make your kids go to global warming camp and they're going to make them stay there. We're going to make your kid change their major to environmentalism. We're going to have 50,000 people to do that. And Kamala Harris will make 50,000 American kids study global warming under an emergency act. Is that possible? Are these wild things possible?
No. Now, let's begin by saying a blanket statement, which is there is no statute that can be used to trump somebody's constitutional rights. So if you have a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, and you are a qualified gun owner, you don't have you've not been declared mentally incompetent, you're not a convicted felon, all of the other things that would disqualify you from lawfully possessing a firearm. If you don't have any of those disabilities, there is no statute or no national emergency that could lead the president to come in and deprive you of your Second Amendment rights. Similarly, if they sat there and said, we're going to put you into some kind of an indoctrination camp for global warming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you have a First Amendment right, to speak about your issues. You're entitled to have some control over how your children are educated. I mean, look, our public schools teach a lot of stuff that some of us may not like that's politically correct. Government does have some authority to do that, but they do not have the ability to take you and to put you into indoctrination camps, and they don't have the ability to come and seize your guns. Now, there are a lot of state laws that people will pass to try to form gun registries or background checks at gun shows, and those are always subject to Second Amendment challenges. But a president could not just come in and say, I've decided that gun violence is a national emergency, and therefore I'm declaring a national emergency and ordering police authorities and the National Guard to go in and seize the firearms of every lawful gun owner. Just couldn't do that.
Okay, so 2 more questions, and you're doing such a great job of answering, and then so we can get through all of this, because this is one of those ones where people should be prepared to share this podcast because it will calm a lot of people down, especially on a Friday afternoon. It's snowing here in Missouri, so I'm already freaked out because I'm so sick of this real winter. I want the fake winter I had last year, and the global warming I was promised. I don't mind telling you. But so there's 2 more things. First of all, where does the money go? So let's talk about the El Chapo Act. That was something that's been put forward by Senator Ted Cruz. Right. And what he wants to do is take the $14 billion that the U.S. government is currently confiscated from El Chapo. He wants to designate that money for wall funding, because then it would actually be a Mexican paying for the wall. But isn't that money going to end up in the U.S. Treasury anyway and be subject to the president utilizing it for whatever, because it has to do with drugs and he's dealing with the issue of the border?
Well, so let's break this down. So part of the conviction for Juan Guzman, El Chapo, involved a criminal forfeiture. I think it was for $14 billion. I don't know how. So they're entitled to get, wherever they find assets of Chapo Guzman's, up to $14 billion. I don't think they have in hand anything like $14 billion. I would be surprised if they had more than $1 billion or so. So what Ted Cruz has proposed, and Congress could do this if it wants to, is to say this is a criminal forfeiture, and we want to designate these funds for this purpose. Congress can appropriate money. It's now the federal government's money, and he can do that. I don't think that law is going to pass because the House of Representatives, controlled by the Democrats, are never going to allow it to pass. But if it doesn't, whatever funds are seized in that case become part of a forfeiture fund. There are, in fact, two forfeiture funds, one run by the Department of Justice and one run by the Department of Treasury. The president has tapped into the fund controlled by the Treasury Department because he has more of a free hand as to how that money can be spent. The money in the Justice Department's forfeiture fund, there are more strings attached. It says that the government must spend the money on this, that, and the other, and there's probably less flexibility to use that money for wall funding. But if Congress passed an act that said the president can use these funds for wall funding, then he could do it.
Okay, so another question that is just these are coming at me hard and fast. So there's a bill, there's actual law that says that. So right now, the drug cartels are transcriminal organizations. That's their designation. But if they were to be designated terrorist organizations because of the death toll, you can associate the deaths for opioid overdoses, 70,000 a year, all the deaths for drunk driving, 10% of all of our drunk driving, right. Is from illegal aliens, et cetera, et cetera. If you tally that up, we're talking about well over 100,000 people a year. That far dwarfs the number of people who are killed by guns a year, even if you include the suicide numbers. So this is a real problem that we're facing at the border. And these transnational criminal organizations actually operate like terrorist organizations using militarized weaponry. They operate in more than one country, 40 countries, I think, at last count. And they are organized in a militaristic fashion, and they're waging a war by moving illicit materials through our border. Right. So it's like they're waging a war on us. Why doesn't the president use that? Because it completely shuts Congress out of the deal, because the ability to designate organizations as terrorists is remanded to the executive, and he's the commander in chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, and he can use money that's already allocated in the defense budget to wage war on them. He could even use drones to kill cartel members.
No, that's all true, and you make a somewhat compelling case for that, although it would be a rather radical extension of our nation's drug interdiction efforts. I mean, there are statutes like the Posse Comitatus Act that prohibit the military for being used for domestic law enforcement. Our drug interdiction efforts, while they certainly have a transnational aspect to it, and there's no question these are well-funded organizations that have military equipment, and they corrupt governments in the countries in which they operate. It's been perceived as being a domestic law enforcement function, and the president hasn't felt the need to go that far because he doesn't need to in order to do what it is he wants to do now to build a wall. However, if he wanted to use a broader use of our military to go into Central and South America or other countries in order to combat drugs beyond what he does now, then he might have to resort to that kind of authority.
Yeah, I read an article on Conservative Review. I think it's by David Horowitz, and he talks about 10 U.S.C. Section 10 allowing the Secretary of Defense, upon request from federal or state law enforcement dealing with drug trafficking and in conjunction with the Secretary of State, to provide support for the counter-drug activities or activities to counter transnational organized crime, and that subsection B7 allows DOD to provide help in the form of construction of roads, fences, installation of lighting to block drug smuggling corridors across international boundaries of the U.S. This is already existing law.
Yes, no, that's right. And in fact, Title 10, United States Code Section 284, is the provision I cited before, and it does allow, when there's a declaration of emergency, for the Secretary of Defense in order to, and here's a quote, use funds for, quote, construction of roads and fences and installation of lighting to block drug smuggling corridors across international boundaries of the United States. And that is one of the authorities that the president is relying upon today.
Okay, so last question has to do with what the president actually said from the Rose Garden, and we've been discussing it on the show ad nauseum, which is everything he does, basically the Democrats take it to the naughty Ninth Circuit, and they put a national injunction on it. Do they have the ability to enjoin him from declaring a national emergency?
Well, they don't have the ability to enjoin him from declaring a national emergency. What they're going to try to do is challenge the legitimacy of that invocation and challenge his ability to build the wall. So somebody is now going to file a lawsuit, whether it's the House of Representatives or some interest group or some homeowner whose property is being forfeited under eminent domain in order to build this barrier, and it will likely be filed in California, since California is within the Ninth Circuit. If they filed it in Texas, they'd be in the more conservative Fifth Circuit, and then we'll be off to the races. Courts have traditionally been reluctant to second-guess the president when it comes to national security decisions. Presidents receive daily classified briefings from the intelligence community. Article 3 federal judges do not. But as we saw with the travel ban and with this president, there appear to be a lot of judges out there who have no reluctance whatsoever about second-guessing this president and try to enjoin him from doing what it is he wants to do. But if a judge does, in fact, enter a nationwide injunction, that will dramatically increase the odds that there'll be an expedited review up to and including the Supreme Court.
Okay. All right. So I actually have a few more questions for you, but we're out of time. I will say this, John Malcolm of the Heritage Foundation, you're a fast talker, and I love that. And you answered every single question. We have to have you back to talk about this some more. I want to kind of, I think it's possible that maybe because you have all this expertise, and I know the Heritage Foundation is available, your experts and your work is available to the president to call on, and perhaps he's already been briefed. That's what I always assume, because that's his job, that he already knows everything you shared with us today, and so that this is going to actually end up with some wall being built, because many millions of us Americans voted for him for that issue. And it's not a partisan thing for us. It's really about safety of Americans. And so I thank you so much for your time today and coming on. We look forward to speaking to you again. John Malcolm, VP of the Institute for Constitutional Government at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, sir.
Good to be with you.
All right. Talk to you again soon. We will be back with the last segment of the show right after this. So you stay right there.